I've got a PowerPoint, which you won't see, so you'll have to kind of imagine what's there. The first slide shows my two latest books, which is this one here. This took 10 years to write. I started it twice, and twice I finished it, was unhappy with what I'd written and started again. And so this is the third take of this book, why it took 10 years. This book took me only a year, and I didn't have to write that one. Why I talk about this rewriting of a manuscript is because the first time I set about writing about the Prophet, peace be upon him, in war, I wrote something that was kind of a bit conformist and just playing to the audience as a Muslim of a traditional narrative of the campaigns of our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him. I finished the book and felt dissatisfied and disingenuous. I thought, I don't believe what I've written. So I had a second take. It took another 3 years or so to do a second version. Felt this time I got it. I reread the whole thing and thought, I haven't got it yet. And I'll explain why in a second. So I had a third take at it, a third go, and alhamdulillah, the book is now finished and out, and I'm sort of happy with it. Scholars are never happy with their scholarship. We always think we could have done better, we could have done better. But the thing about this book is that it, in some ways, set me a great challenge as a Muslim and as a historian, which I'll come to in a second. We have two different methodologies. And when you approach the past as a historian, you use a modern critical method of interrogating sources, of trying to step back from your biases and achieve a degree of objectivity. The exact opposite of what you do as a religious person. We love our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, very much. And so we want to present him critically, uncritically, as a perfect, paradigmatic human. And so there's two parts of me that are working against each other. The objective historian who says, I should study him with the same criticality of thought as if I'm studying Julius Caesar. And the Muslim inside me which says, well, he's my prophet, and I follow him. So these two things are happening inside me. And interestingly enough, this is the same experience I had when I first became a Muslim about 21 years ago. The first book I ever read about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was, which you can't see, but it's on my screen, Karen Armstrong's book, Muhammad, a Biography of the Prophet. And Karen Armstrong is a wonderful scholar of religion who uses that same critical method that I use as a historian. She looked at the Arabic sources, but as a non-Muslim said, this is what I believe his life amounted to. These are the things that he did, and these are the things I believe caused him to do that. And I read that book just after 9/11 to try and understand what Islam was all about. And that book by Karen Armstrong, a non-Muslim, was the beginning of my journey to Islam. That's the first book I read about him. The second book is called The Sealed Nectar, and it's the most popular biography of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in circulation at the moment. And I was so disappointed and upset by the book that I thought, Muslims believe this stuff? You've got to be kidding. The method was just lacking. It was just this desire to present him as kind of like a Superman, as being beyond what human character and nature would allow a person to live as. It just put him beyond any kind of critical access. And as a scholar, I thought, that's too much. Muslims believe that stuff, Islam isn't for me. But I persisted and continued to read and began to dive into the sources upon which both biographies were based upon, and began to develop my own understanding of our beloved Prophet's life, peace be upon him, which eventually led me to becoming a Muslim. I say to my friend Shahid today that I immerse myself every day in the seerah, the biography of our Prophet. I actually get paid to do it. I read his life for 3 or 4 hours a day. I write his life for 3 or 4 hours a day and get paid for that. How's that for a job? And so I feel enormously connected to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But as I mentioned, I want to write books that are illuminating, not just for Muslims. And if the answer is, well, God did it, and that's the only thing I can explain, or that's the only explanatory tool I have, is that, well, he's the prophet, and God did it, then there's no non-Muslim in the world that can access my book, because they would believe that. And so that can't be the only explanation. Otherwise, how can we reach out to the world and say, have a look at this guy, he's worth looking at? We have to have something else to say apart from simply God did it. And the thing we have to say is actually Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, also did it. He had what's called agency. He had a mind that made decisions. He weighed up situations. He had human emotions at play. Sometimes he was cross at people. Sometimes he was sad. Sometimes he knew he had hard choices to make. But he made those choices as a man. Yes, a prophet of God, but as a man. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, these two things are at work within me as a scholar. I apply what's called the historical critical method of analysis, which means that, as I'll explain in a second, the past leaves sources, and historians use sources to reconstruct the past, like a jigsaw puzzle. And that's quite different than the Islamic tradition, which has a very sanitized and perfect narrative that we've developed over 1400 years that is beyond critique. And actually, nothing within our tradition should be beyond critique. As scholars, we should say, how do we know that? Are we sure about that? And if the answers are, well, maybe we're not sure about it, the evidence for that is slim. Nothing wrong with saying that. It's not Quran, which we believe is a perfect book. It's Sirah. It's the biography of the Prophet. It's created by humans. It's open to human interpretation and reinterpretation. Nothing wrong with that. And as I said, I want to write books that just say what I understand to be true, whether the reader is a Muslim or whether the reader is a non-Muslim. If my book is only of value to a Muslim, I haven't done a very good job. And at the same token, I know that many of my readers are fellow Muslims. And if I lose them with my approach, again, I haven't done a very good job. So I have to find some type of objective way of reaching out as a scholar to readers, whoever they are. And that's not easy. And it's not easy because if I were to say to you that as a scholar, I have to look at the life of Muhammad, peace be upon him, as if he's any other historical figure. You might say, well, that's disrespectful because he wasn't. He's the final prophet. Well, fair enough, but he was a historical figure. He did exist. He walked the earth. He did stuff. And so looking at that as a historian means I have to have a method. And the only method that I know of arriving at something that I can say is a set of true statements is the historical critical method. I'm not an apologist. I am religious. I love my prophet, but I'm not an apologist. I believe my responsibility is different. So where does this come from? It comes from the Enlightenment, and then what's called modernity. Modernity pushed the scientific method to the forefront of human analysis. And social scientists and people from the humanities like me, we wanted to create a kind of a version of the scientific method for understanding how humans interact, how humans operate. And so we created a method for doing that. The method is based actually on the rejection of all supernatural or religious explanations. We don't have to say God did it. Well, which God did it? If you were in ancient Greek, you could say, in ancient Greece, you'd say, well, Zeus did it. If you were in Norway 1,000 years ago, you'd say Odin did it. If you were in Alabama, you would say Jesus Christ did it. And we just happen to be mostly Muslims in this room where we say Allah did it. But this method that I'm talking about asks us to step back from that and say, what other explanations might there be? And we put human agency to the forefront of saying, well, humans live. Whether they're believers or not, they make decisions. And so it's looking at the decisions that people make based on their circumstances that this method is all about. Now, I mentioned that the past gives rise to myths. Now, I'm not saying the life of the prophet is mythical. God forbid, he lived. We can be pretty certain about that, and you can ask me what my evidence is later. But the job of the historian is to challenge myths. And to do that, we use what are called sources. Sources are those artifacts that humans leave, which could be a written document. It could be a book that someone writes. It could be a diary that someone writes. It could be the study of gravestones to see how come in the year 1636 in this particular town in Britain, most people are dying before the age of 10 or 12. And if you look at the gravestones, you'll realize, for example, there was some type of disease or sickness or something that swept. Now, I'll give you an example of that. Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights 150 years ago, more than 150 years ago. She lived in the north here, in North Yorkshire. The average life expectancy in her town when she was writing Wuthering Heights was 27. Now it's 81. So something's dramatically different. And how do we know that? The answer is go check the gravestones. And you'll see that what I'm saying is true. That was the life expectancy during the period when Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights. So historians look at evidence, and in a way it's like a court case. The lawyer on each side who has the strongest evidence and uses that to make the strongest case will win. Historians have the same challenge, to use the strongest evidence to make the strongest case. And it gives it a persuasive power that is kind of important. But it only works with what's called objectivity, which is our ability to step back from biases and preconceptions, from all those assumptions that we have, the things that we're brought up with as Muslims, or as Christians, or as Jews, or as Hindus, or as atheists. We have assumptions about the world based on where we're born, based on the social circumstances into which we are born, and so on. And when we come to the sources that I mentioned, we have to look at them without any preference or prejudice. And bias can be for something. I'm biased in favor of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. That's my natural state of bias, which I declared. I have to step back from that as a scholar. Likewise, you could be biased against somebody. And we normally call this a prejudice. But both are just as bad when it comes to analyzing something objectively. Being biased in favor of something or biased against something. And stepping back from it is part of this process that I'm mentioning. So we have to step back from political, cultural, religious, or other biases when we try and reconstruct the past. Now, the challenge for us is that normally in our method, as historians, we like to read both sides. So if we're reading about World War II, we have to read, I wrote my first book on the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 and 43. I had to go to Germany and read the German archives. I had to go to Russia and read the Russian archives so that I could make a judgment based on treating both sides equally. Well, that's great. When you approach the life of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, there is no other sources. We don't have sources from the Quraysh, for example, saying, oh, we went and fought this man, Muhammad, rotten scoundrel, and we fought a battle at Badr, and gosh, he defeated us. We don't have anything like that. The Jews of Hayward, for example, that he went to war against, we don't have them saying, oh, we suffered the most terrible fate at the hands of this man, Muhammad. We don't have anything from the other side. We don't even have any commentary from within his lifetime, from Persia, from within Jordan, within Palestine. There's just simply no sources apart from the Islamic narrative. And so there aren't two sides that we can draw upon to create a narrative. We only have the Islamic sources and nothing else. And for me, that's again a complication, because I am a professional historian, and I'm also a committed Muslim. But truth matters to me, regardless of whether I'm a Muslim, or a Jew, or a Hindu, or an atheist. Truth matters. And I'm driven, that's why I became a historian, to try and say something true. And truth itself, at the moment, because of postmodernity, we're being challenged by it. We live in a world where we're told there's no objective truth anymore. And I fight that with all my strength. Truth matters. So, let's think about what's called hagiography. Hagiography is the study of the life of a saint. The word hagion is like Hagia Sophia, the saint wisdom or knowledge. Now it's a mosque in Istanbul. And we have, as Muslims, a tendency to hagiography. We write about our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, as a perfect paradigmatic human. That's okay, but let's be honest, that's what we do. Now, as I said, that's not okay if you're a non-Muslim. And you read a book written by a Muslim about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, you can't access it. There's no way into it. Now we say, oh, we should do dawah to the world. But the dawah we do when it comes to the life of our Prophet is hagiographic. We're trying to present him in a perfect light because that's how in our hearts we feel about him. And that's okay, I'm not criticizing it. But the problem is that the books of Sirah that we have Ibn Hisham, and we have Al-Waqidi, and we have Ibn Sa'ad, and we have Al-Ladhari, and others, they are hagiographic. They were written with this explicit intention to present our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, in that way. The challenge for me as a historian is to say, what can I find in those books that might nonetheless contain a kernel of truth behind all that hagiography? And to go looking for that is quite complicated, but worth doing. Those books have what's called a sacralizing tendency, which means a desire to imbue everything in our Prophet's life, peace be upon him, with a sacred character or quality. And that's fine again, except as I said, our Prophet walked the earth as a human and did everything that humans do. He brushed his teeth with a miswak. He did everything that humans do. He lived as a person. Peace be upon him, are based on are stories of miracles. And miracles are where we believe that God somehow enters his creation and does something against the laws of nature or physics. That's a miracle. Otherwise, everything else is simply natural and not supernatural. What do I make of those as a historian? How do I present them to a readership that might include non-Muslims? It's pretty tricky. As a Muslim, we're told that at the Battle of Badr, the angels came and threw stones and defeated the Quraysh. How do I say that to a non-Muslim? Say, this is what, as Muslims, we hold to be true. They're going to say, well, good for you, but that seems a bit nuts. And so I don't want to lose my fidelity to my religion or to my sources. But I also understand that there are other explanations. And the other explanations don't contradict that. You can't prove it one way or the other. But we have records of things that happened on the earth 1400 years ago that involve humans making what seem to be rather mundane decisions. And sometimes actually rather extraordinary decisions. And it's those decisions that I'd like to get at. So how do I go about this? The answer is I have to step back from my positive bias towards Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. I have to do that consciously because I'm awfully fond of him. He's someone that I follow as the core of my religious experience. And I have to look at him as if he is any historical figure. And you might say, well, that's a terrible thing to say. It really isn't. Because I'm not approaching him with disdain or disgust or hatred. I'm just saying, for the purpose of me as a scholar, let's see if I can't step back and become at least neutral and just look at the sources for his life through a critical lens. And critical doesn't mean negative, it's about critiquing. The supernatural claims, I read them in my books of Sarah. How do I deal with them? The answer is I say that's what they believed. The prophet believed that the angels came. The warriors fighting in the Battle of Badr believed that they saw the angels come, riding on horses, by the way, angelic horses. And Ibn Hisham, we know what the horses looked like. We even know what the angelic horses' bridles looked like. The descriptions are there and very colorful. And as a historian, I say that's what they believed. That's what they believed. I don't have to say whether I agree it's true or untrue. That's not my job as a historian. But as I said, humans had agency, including our beloved prophet, peace be upon him, which is the ability to act, to react, to assess, and to decide things. And as a historian, I just want to analyze the participants in events in their own right, without trying to affirm or deny any supernatural claims. And the biggest challenge is, how do I step back from my life in the 21st century, where we live in a world without slavery? We live in a world where peace is the default setting. Now we see a terrible war in Gaza. We see a terrible war in Ukraine. You might not believe we live in a world of peace, but we do. We even have an international order that's based on peace. And I'll come back to that soon. How do I put myself into the mind of someone living 1400 years ago in the 7th century, where there were, in the Hijaz alone, the little part of Arabia where our beloved prophet, peace be upon him, lived, 60 tribes at war with each other constantly at war with each other. War was the default setting, not peace. So we live in a world where we have law. We have a government, we have a central body of law, we have the police to enforce it, and if we talk about international law, we have international bodies like the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and so on, to regulate behavior. Imagine living in lawless, stateless Arabia 1400 years ago. There wasn't a single state in Arabia. The prophet never created one. He created something that looked like other tribes around him. But the difference is that this tribe, his ummah, wasn't based on family descent or connection, genealogy. It was based on religious confession. Remarkable. An innovation, and the best possible use of the word innovation. But as I said, amongst all those other people, there was a constant state of war. And this man creates this new community, this new kind of tribe, where there's 60 others in constant war with each other and now with him. And he has to give birth to something that's going to outlast him. How's he going to do that? What tools is he going to use? What's the strategy going to be? And that's what I like to write about. And if you could see my screen, I have 3 covers of books about what's called present-centeredness, about anachronisms, reading into the past things that didn't exist. One of them is a book called Muhammad, Islam's First Great General, by a Canadian scholar called Richard Gabriel, in which he says that our beloved prophet, peace be upon him, was the world's first insurgent. And he was an assassin who used assassination as a strategy of war. Now, you might think that's terribly offensive. He's not a Muslim. He doesn't mind saying those things. And you don't have to read it. But that's what the book says. And he's using phraseology that's effectively based on his experience of the war on terror for the last 20 years. Another book is by a man called Juan Cole. It's called Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires, in which he's desperate to show that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was some type of pacifist who avoided war and fought only reluctantly when he had no other choice and hated the experience of it. And that all those things that we take for granted, the Banu Qurayza or the Qainuqa or the Nadir or the wars against Khaybar, were later inventions created in the Abbasid world as a way of kind of dealing with the Jews of the time. And so he's so, I won't say help him, but he's so committed to creating a pacifistic Muhammad, peace be upon him, that he does exactly what I'm talking about. He's created something that didn't exist. And the third book is called The Generalship of Muhammad, Battles and Campaigns of the Prophet of Allah, by a man called Russ Rogers, in which he says that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a prime minister. He was a field marshal. He was a high court judge. He was all these things put together in one person. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was none of those things. There were no generals. There were no high court judges. There were no prime ministers. This was stateless. It was actually stateless Arabia, where there was no centralized polity or government. Society was rather lawless, apart from a kind of an informal understanding between tribes, unwritten, on what would be acceptable and unacceptable between them. So these are examples of anachronism, reading into the past things based on what we want them to be today. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. So my view is that the only way we can actually make sense of Prophet Muhammad's, peace be upon him, leadership is by seeing them within the context of the 7th century. Very, very different to 21st century Britain. Removing them from that context creates a great intellectual challenge. But we as Muslims have a concept of sunnah, where we say everything that he did is doable because he did it. And he wouldn't have done it unless it was good. If it was good then, it's good today. And that's awkward for me as a historian and as a Muslim. And I'll come to that as I go through the rest of my talk. I'm not bold enough as a scholar to say that whatever worked then will still work today. Whether it's his leadership, whether it's his generalship, and I repeat, he wasn't a general. He was just one of his men who just happened to be the sheikh, and therefore was allowed to lead from the front of a battle. There was no army. It was just this kind of casual militia of citizens. You can challenge me on this as we go through. Some things clearly seem to work better than others. Today, I teach military strategy to generals as part of what I've done for 30 years as my job. Surprisingly, the enemy always brings benefit to you and detriment to the enemy. And it did in the life of our Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. He sought to surprise the enemy. So you could say those sorts of things are universal. They're not time-specific. Fine. Most other things in his life were contextual. And it's hard to take them out of that context and universalize them and say, well, it's everything he did is equally applicable today. The world has changed. Things are different. Some things might work, some things might not work. And there's no disrespect in saying that. I do believe that the life of Prophet Muhammad, my prophet, peace be upon him, contains wisdom without equal, and that this wisdom I would like to illustrate. I accept that, but I go back to my start point, that I have to have a method, I have to have evidence, and I have to have objectivity or judgment when I assess those. One of the problems, I think, with books on Prophet's leadership, on the Prophet's leadership, peace be upon him, is that we have the wrong start point. We love him because he was terribly moral, that he was devout, he was honest, compassionate, tolerant, patient, fair, decisive, courageous. Therefore, he was a great leader. He was a great leader because he was a great man. He was morally good, therefore he was a great leader. That's our start point when we read books about our prophet, especially about his leadership, be upon him. So we look at traits when we look at his life, his traits, his qualities of character. That's fine. But there's something deficient in the argument that he was both a very good man and a very good leader, and that he was therefore a very good leader because he was a very good man. It doesn't make sense. I was born in 1964. I know that's a very, very long time ago now for most of you. I'm 59 years old. I was born 15 years after the death of Adolf Hitler. I was born 13 years, I think, or so, after the 1951, 13 years after the death of Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin shaped the 20th century like you could not imagine. He created the modern Soviet Union. He led for 30 years and transformed an agrarian backward state into a world superpower. In every human regard, he was a great leader, but he was not a great man. Even if you look at, for example, I don't know, Hitler, Napoleon, new movie out, I hope you'll all go and see it, about the life of Napoleon. Napoleon was a great, great, great military commander. He was a great statesman. One of my favorite scholars said he's the most competent human that's ever lived, meaning that he was just capable in a variety of areas. But he wasn't a good man. And I'm told the film shows what happened on the beaches of Acre, which is in Lebanon today, where Napoleon had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people each day for nearly a week, bayoneted to death because he couldn't afford to feed them. So you mustn't think that because someone's a great person, they're a great leader, or they're a great leader because they're a great person. The things don't go together. And that's not to say that Prophet Muhammad wasn't a great human. I see him with elevated morality, which I can't deny. As I mentioned, I became a Muslim because of him. I read his biography and thought, yeah, that's a man to follow. But that's not why he was a great leader. And that's what I kind of want to work through. So that old-fashioned way of looking at human traits, as a historian, I can't buy into that. And even in leadership schools and military colleges, we don't teach leadership based on human traits anymore, of what is a person and the equality of character. We don't do that anymore. But Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a very good leader, and he was a very good military commander. And that's what I kind of will talk a bit about. The Holy Quran came as revelations between 610 and 632. Sometimes there was a gap of 2 years, no revelation. Nothing came to him. Sometimes each day was flooded with revelations to the point where he couldn't almost cope. The burden upon him was so great. And it happened when he needed things in his life to be revealed. God revealed it. We believe that as Muslims. And that's the same with the laws of war. When he's in Mecca for the first 10 years of his ministry, he's powerless. He's this guy who's got like 20 followers at one point, 30 followers at another point, mostly teenagers, by the way. What does he need to know about war? He's not at war. But after the second pledge of Aqaba, he knows he's going to be going to Al-Medina, Yathrib, and he makes this pledge to them and says, I will join the defense of this city against your enemies. And at this point, he realizes that he's going to exist in a very temporal, a very human environment where there may be some fighting. And God brings down a revelation, which I'll show you soon, but I have to explain it. I had it on a slide, in which God permits that war. Now, the point I'm making about this is that that's how the concepts of war were revealed in relation to things that were physically happening on the ground in his life. Now, I came from a different faith tradition where I read the Torah and knew the Torah pretty well. I read it in the original Hebrew, and I knew the stories of the different prophets. Joshua, who fit the Battle of Jericho, to quote the song, marched around the city of Jericho 7 times, blew the shofar, the walls came tumbling down. Every Christian, for example, will know this. Every Jew knows this story. You don't. Why, as Muslims, don't you know this story of Joshua at Jericho? I'll tell you why. Because in the Torah it says that The Israelites, they went into that city and they killed every woman, man, old person, baby, child, donkey, horse, camel, destroyed the crops. Our Quran doesn't continue with that wahi, wherever that came from. And most things that are in the Torah find their way some way into the Quran. Not those stories. They don't. Those stories of today we would find difficult to swallow from the Torah don't come as stories of war in the Quran. Listen to this one from Joshua 6:21 from the Torah. At Jericho, quote, they, the Israelites, destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. What about this one? This is from 1 Samuel 15:3. This is the prophet Samuel speaking as God, saying, God says, go and attack Amalek, the Amalekites. Now you'll know this from Netanyahu last month. Go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare anyone. Kill both men and women, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. We don't have that in Quran. And so there's been a discontinuity from one book to another, from the Torah into the Quran. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, did go to war. He sent out around 53 missions, expeditions, Saraya in Hebrew. Saraya is the singular, that involved armed soldiers going out into the areas roundabout and doing war stuff, let's call it that. 53 of those that he didn't lead himself. And 27 that he did lead himself. The Prophet led military formations 27 times himself. That means there's 80 campaigns or military expeditions in 10 years. That means there's 8 a year, which means that the Prophet sent out warriors to do war stuff once every 6 weeks for a decade. That needs explaining. But actually, when you explain it, it's pretty reasonable. And I'll tell you why. We often don't understand why the Prophet, peace be upon him, did that, why he went to war. We come up with all sorts of modern convoluted explanations. Oh, the Quraysh had expelled them from Mecca. When this Qurayshi caravan was coming past, they said, well, if we go and nick stuff from them, it's only getting back the value of our property that was lost. We've only been saying this as an explanation very recently, by the way. The ulama throughout the last 1400 years didn't say that. We say it now. And you've probably heard some of those things. But what we should think about is actually the nature of 7th century Arabia, where you take a boy who's 15 years old or 16 years old. You have to have a process to turn that boy into a man. And military expeditions was the method that they used. And there was nothing else as a coming of age ritual. And we know from what's called ethnography. Ethnography is where an anthropologist or a sociologist goes and studies a tribe in the Amazon or a tribe in Arabia and sees what they do. And for the last 200 years, people have been going to Arabia and seeing that, guess what happens at around the age of 15? Off they go on expeditions against the neighboring tribes. They're already at war with them. It's not upsetting the state of peace. There is no state of peace. Trying to, if you can, stealthily abscond with some camels or some goats or some horses, show some manliness. And this process is teaching young boys to endure hardship, the jihad, because this was really difficult. It taught them hardiness and strength of character, comradeship, build bonds of trust between them as boys. All of these things that would turn young boys into men was what this raiding was all about. And our Prophet, peace be upon him, arrives in what's Yathrib and becomes a leader very quickly. And he's got all these young boys who were expecting at the age of 15 that now it's my turn to go out on raids. And that's what they did. They weren't against friends. They weren't against neutrals. I repeat, there were 60 tribes around about, all in a constant state of war. These were their enemies. And the other thing about this is we know because it was a rite of passage, it was defined in social custom as a type of sport. The idea wasn't to kill, unless you absolutely have to. The idea wasn't to steal the women of the enemy tribe. It was stealthily to abscond with things that would bring wealth to your own tribe, like cattle and camels. And in fact, you were, by the rules of the game, not supposed to kill unless you had to. And you were never to kill women and children or old people. So regardless of what you think about, what you've heard about the Prophet's raids, almost all of them were casualtyless. No one died on them. The idea was you would go out on expeditions for a week or 2 weeks. It's hot, it's hard, mostly on foot, sometimes on camel. You had to provide your own weapon, which was normally a sword or a knife, or a bow and arrow, or a long spear. Sneak up on the herds of an enemy tribe, grab those camels and go back, and take them and then redistribute those camels among the tribe, which increases wealth. And guess what? They're trying to do it to your camels at the same time. And that's how society was. How do we know this? We know it, as I mentioned, from ethnography. We've gone and studied Arabic Bedouin tribes for hundreds of years now. We know it from what's called the Days of the Arabs, which was the literary sources from the Jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic period. And they wrote narratives about these things where they explained the raids in great detail. And we know it from pre-Islamic poetry, which talks exactly in the same way about these raids as the Islamic tradition does. Now, when we look at war, we're colored by the experience of the 20th century. On my screen, which I wish I could show you, is a newspaper account from the Daily Telegraph, the Telegraph in Britain. The headline says this: "Are the bodies of 10,000 lost warriors from the Battle of Hastings buried in this field?" 10,000. When did the Battle of Hastings take place? 1066. It's the most famous battle in British history. Lasted about 3 hours. 10,000 soldiers died. Their bodies are still buried there. 10,000 in 3 hours, 3,300 an hour. Dead. You think about the Second World War, which is actually our lens for understanding war. We define everything by what happened 75 years ago and what was this supposed good war. Guess how many people died in the Second World War? 60 million. 10 million a year. That's 3,000 dead people a day. 3,000 a day. Of which, by the way, 2,000 out of 3,000 were civilians. 2/3 were civilians, 1/3 were combatants. 3,000 a day. Then let me tell you about the Prophet's battles, peace be upon him. He fought battles for 10 years. Do you know how many people died? 354 in 10 years. 216 from the Quraysh and their allies, 138 Muslims in 10 years. That means only 2 enemy soldiers died a month, and only 1 Muslim became a martyr a month throughout that decade. So when you look at 3,000 dying a day in the Second World War through horrendous violence and deprivations, and you think of 354 people in a decade, only 2 enemies a month, and only 1 Muslim a month dying, it shows you that this was rather different from how we understand war, how we understand campaigns. Remarkably humane and casualty less. In fact, we know, scholars of Sirah, like me, every single name of every Muslim who died in that 10-year period. There were so few of them. Every single one we know who killed them, how they died. It's all there because there's so few people. So it's quite different to how we imagine war. Now, why is that? It's because God believes in human life. It's what he created. And he imbued it with a sanctity that comes out in Quran very strongly. In Surah Al-Ma'idah 32, which is quite a late surah, revealed in 7 after the Hijrah, 7 Hijrah, he says this: if anyone kills a person, unless it's for murder or fasad in the land, it's though he's killed all of humanity. And whoever saves a life, it's as though he's saved all of humanity. That's rather beautiful. Does anyone know where that's from? That quote?
Holocaust survivor?
It's not from a Holocaust survivor. This is from, is that here somewhere? It's from the Babylonian Talmud, which is a book in the Jewish tradition from a tractate called Sanhedrin. And Jewish scholars will immediately recognize it, that this is coming to Quran as a revelation from God, consistent with an earlier revelation, which is what it says in the surah. After the Prophet arrives in Yathrib, he's in a position where suddenly he's contracted through the second pledge of Aqaba as now a member of a new community to go to war if they have to. And we have something that we call the Dustur al-Medina, the Constitution of Medina, very grand title, which talks exactly about that, the responsibilities to go and fight for the common good. Well, how does that happen? The answer is Allah allowed it, according to the Quran. This is what it says in Surah Al-Baqarah 216. Fighting is ordained for you, though it's hateful to you. Hateful. It's a very strong word. But it may be that you hate a thing which is good for you and that you love a thing which is bad for you. Allah knows what you don't know. In Surah Al-Hajj, which is also just after the Hijrah, which is why it's called Surah Al-Hajj, God says this: truly Allah will defend those who believe. Truly Allah does not love anyone who's a traitor to faith or shows ingratitude. To those against whom war has been made, permission is given to fight because they are wronged. And truly Allah is most powerful for their aid, those who have been wronged. They are those who have been expelled from their homes in defiance of right, except because they say our Lord is Allah. So this is showing the evolution of the concepts that made war permissible and just to our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him. And as this situation of belligerency grew, and the different tribes actively began to war against the Islamic Ummah, which was this tiny, fragile flower wanting to grow, Allah says this: fight in the cause of Allah, those who fight you. This is in the imperative voice. It's a command. You fight. Not saying if you want, be ever so grateful if you do. God is saying fight. Go fight. It's a command. Fight in the cause of Allah, those who fight you. But don't transgress limits, for Allah doesn't love the transgressors. That's also Surah Al-Baqarah. Now, does that mean that it's wrong to fight? Well, it can't be, because Quran also says, Surah Al-Shura 42, and whoever defends himself after he's been wronged, there is no blame against him. God is making clear that this is a moral act. And war sometimes is moral. Who would say, for example, that it wouldn't be moral for the Palestinians to defend themselves at the moment? Anyone? I dare you to say it in this audience and see what happens. Sometimes war fighting is a moral necessity. And if you, for example, don't oppose evil, you are complicit in that evil. And that's a fact. And certainly when you talked about the Holocaust before, we see that the world stood by when great evil occurred. And The permission of evil is kind of a culpability that exists in our heart as a stain. If we don't oppose evil, what good are we to the world? So I've looked at what things constitute Islamic just war, to make war moral. Self-defense, preemption against evident threat, end of religious oppression, opposition to evil. What about the intention in your heart? And I could give you the Quranic verses to go with this as well. The pursuit of peace, absence of greed, absence of hatred. Don't fight because you hate people. Fight because you have to do something good against something bad. And forgiveness where possible. And in all of those different ayahs of Quran where it talks about fighting, standing against evil, what you can do to the enemy, it always ends with, but forgiveness is better. And again, this is the humane spirit that exists within Islam. Forgiveness is better. Interestingly, both in Christian just war tradition and in Islamic tradition, is what's called last resort, which means you only fight after your attempts at diplomacy have failed. You have to try diplomacy first. You have to try non-violence before you move to violence. You have to try it to the nth degree, to the most you can sincerely, because bloodshed is a terrible, terrible thing. I'm the son of a soldier. My father was deeply, deeply scarred as a person from the things that happened in wars, the things that he did that damaged him in his soul. Killing people is no better than being on the side that gets killed. It's a damaging thing. And God doesn't want us to do this unless it's as a last resort, when there's a necessary reason to do so. And restraint in Islam is something quite beautiful, I think, which is the concept that if the enemy stops fighting, you stop fighting. That's it. The moment he puts his hands up, metaphorically, you can't kill anymore. And this happened in antiquity, 1400 years ago. Our prophet lived in the ancient world, not even in the medieval period, not even in the Renaissance, the early modern period. 1400 years ago, our book said, immediately stop if the enemy stops. And that's entirely uncharacteristic of that period. This is Surah Al-Baqarah. Excuse me. But if they cease, Allah is most gracious, most merciful. Fight them until there is no more fitna and worship is for Allah. And if they desist, which means to stop, then know that hostility can only be directed against the oppressors. That's Surah Al-Baqarah 2, 192. Surah Al-Anfal, which talks about the spoils of war. Quote, and if the enemy inclines to peace, you incline to it also, and put your trust in Allah. Surely He is all-knowing and all-hearing. So you see that even within our holy book, which talks about war, there are rules being put in place for us as Muslims. Rules that are quite beautiful. One of the things that gets taken out of context, however, is this one, Surah Al-Baqarah 2:116. If anyone transgresses against you, you can also retaliate against them to an equal extent. The key word here is extent. The level of violence you can meet proportionately. If they send 1,000 soldiers against you, you can send 1,000 against them. It doesn't talk about the type of violence. It's not permitting, for example, torture. If they torture you, well, you can torture them back. Because our book says you can't repay evil with evil, only with what is good. So we're bound, even in war, against matching what they do in its nature, but in its extent, in the amount that you can do, the amount of force you can use, you can be proportionate. Women, children, the elderly. By the way, I'm 59 years old. In Islam, I am elderly and have been for 9 years. I don't know if you know that. The rules of war preclude killing someone over the age of 50 or having somebody fight over the age of 50. So I've been an old man for 9 years. How about that? Old people can't be harmed in the war. Servants can't be harmed in war. And as I mentioned, women, children are the non-combatants, nor are their houses and their possessions. Yet we live in a world where we see houses demolished, where we see whole cities like Dresden and Hiroshima, Tokyo, demolished. And our book says, leave their houses alone. And I'll quote you soon a hadith to that point. Even prisoners and wounded to be treated with respect and humanity. There's a quote that I'll give you from Sahih Bukhari. The hadith number is 3015, 3015. You think I make these things up? Narrated Ibn Umar, during a campaign of Allah's Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a woman was found killed. Allah's Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, forbade the killing of women and children. We know when this happened. It happened during the Battle of Hunayn. We know exactly the context of the hadith's arrival. He forbade the killing of women and children. If we believe in Sunnah, we stick to what he said. He says we can't kill women and children. We can't kill them with Zionists or Jews in Israel. We can't kill women and children. That's a fact. Our Prophet didn't say you can kill some. He said you may not kill women and children. This is the Prophet's instructions to the army when he sent it to Mutta. He said this. This is the year 629, by the way. Attack in the name of Allah and fight his enemies and yours in Asham. You will encounter men secluded in monasteries, withdrawn from others. Don't attack them. You will find other people who are seeking out Satan. Draw your swords against them. Do not kill a woman or a young child or the old or the bait. You can't do it. And as I mentioned, we live in a world where even the houses of civilians are destroyed wickedly. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq said before he sent out his army under Zayd ibn Abu Sufyan, "O people, stop and I will tell you 10 things. Don't be treacherous. Don't steal from the ghanima, the booty. Do not engage in backstabbing. Do not mutilate anyone. Don't kill a youngster or an old person or a woman. Don't cut off the heads of the palm trees or burn them. Don't cut down the fruit trees. Don't slaughter a sheep or camel or a cow unless you need it for food. And when you pass by people who devote their lives in cloisters, leave them and their devotions alone." So that's rather beautiful. Are you okay? A bit longer?
Yeah.
I'm doing that. So, what about this thing we have where we say, oh, but our Prophet only fought self-defensively? I've been a Muslim 21 years and I used to believe that as well. And I cannot believe it. It doesn't make sense. I'm a scholar of war and I'm a chess player. Does anyone play chess? You try winning a battle of chess, a game of chess, on the defensive. Chess is about staying a step ahead of the opponent continuously. So you act, they have to react. And at no point do they get a chance to act because they're always reacting. You do that by having an offensive strategy. You can't win chess otherwise. War is like that. Our Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, understood that if war did occur, he had to conduct it with vigor, with focus, and with assertiveness. Defense has only a neutral possibility. Defense has only a neutral possibility. Survival. That's all it can deliver an army. Survival, nothing more. You cannot win on the defense. You cannot win on the defense. Defensive actions do not bring decisive results. They bring nothing apart from survivability. The offense has risk, but the risk brings a positive possibility, success. So I'll say that again. Defense has only a neutral possibility, survival. Offense has a positive possibility, success. What would you choose? In a time when there's 59 other tribes, and they all want your destruction, and each other's destruction, not just yours, and you've created this beautiful little flower, this thing called Islam, that could be stuffed out, crushed at any second, because it's small and initially very weak. You have to make sure it survives. But you have to want success for it, because you know that for it to have a long-term future that survives after the Prophet's own death, and he was a man who knew he would die, you want success. And in war, that means the offense. In fact, he wanted all military operations, where he could, to be directed offensively. Why? Because he could then gain, he could retain, and he could exploit both freedom of action and the initiative. It is a game of chess. Play it defensively, you will lose. The only way is to stay ahead of your opponent, force him to react through your actions. And our beloved Prophet was like a chess master. And the Prophet, by taking this forward as a strategy, always forced his opponents to react. And as often as he could, he denied them freedom of movement or the ability to act, forcing him to react, staying one step ahead. And resolute action is mentioned in the Quran. It says in Surah Al-Anfal 860, create fear in the enemies of Allah and your enemy. Create fear in the enemies of Allah and your enemy. You do this through the projection of strength, by taking the fight to the enemy. You don't sit passively and wait for it to come when you're in a position of weakness. If you meet them, this is also Surah Al-Anfal, verse 60, if you meet them in combat, deal with them resolutely to deter those who would come behind them, so they may take notice of you. And our Prophet, peace be upon him, correctly understood that frightening an enemy into deciding not to fight or behave threateningly or recklessly towards you was an ideal way of preventing bloodshed on both sides. And in this way, his philosophy was akin to Theodore Roosevelt, who was an early American president, first years of the 20th century, who said this: speak softly and carry a big stick. Speak softly and carry a big stick. The speak softly relates to diplomacy. You seek diplomacy through diplomatic engagement and sweet words, even to your enemies, to minimize the chance of violence. But you carry a big stick, which means strength in arms, so that your enemy knows that it's actually better to negotiate than to fight. And our Prophet had exactly this spirit. He wanted diplomacy. He was a very good diplomat. This is the new book I'm writing, Diplomacy of Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was a very good diplomat, but he also knew that needed strength behind it. It needed a kind of a deterrent or coercive power. And our Prophet, peace be upon him, felt satisfied that through offensive operations, and many of those were only designed as casualty-like demonstrations of strength, enemies would know better than to cause mischief or mess with the Islamic polity. And in Sahih al-Bukhari, he listed his abilities that Allah had given him. And amongst the 5 things he listed that were unique to him was, quote, the ability to strike fear into the hearts of enemies from as far away as a month of journeying. To strike fear into the hearts of enemies from as far away as a month of journeying. Our Prophet was not a pacifist. He wasn't some wussy guy who said, oh, leave me alone, leave me alone. He wanted people to take him seriously. This was a conflictual violence. ridden society. And amongst all of that, this beautiful thing that has grown now, a quarter of the world's population adhere to Islam, had to survive. And this was the mechanism that he had for making sure. So how moral then was the war of the Prophet, the wars of the Prophet? We use a phrase today. We say something's a necessary evil. And I always ask myself, as someone who actually teaches a lot about war but doesn't like it, that war looks sometimes like a necessary evil. The problem with saying, oh, our Prophet saw that as a necessary evil, is that it's untrue. War was an ordinary part of human life until the 20th century, when through the deaths of around 80 million people in 2 world wars, we said, enough is enough. And we rolled out these great statements of humanity, like the Genocide Convention of 1948, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where we created new Geneva Conventions in 1949, rolled out additional protocols of the Geneva Conventions in 1977. War is a rotten, awful, violent business that claims the life of too many people. It's not a necessary evil. The Prophet would do nothing evil. That concept wasn't known. This modern concept of war as being wrong and alien to society wasn't known 1400 years ago. In antiquity, war was just as much a part of life as eating your dinner every evening. It was just a normal part of life. And in fact, it was part of life that was socially esteemed. If you could be a hero, you're 17 years old and you come back to your tribe and say, look what I did, Mum. You are socially esteemed and your status in the tribe grows because you proved yourself at war. And this is 7th century Arabia. But as I mentioned, very humane, low casualties, sometimes no casualties. 80 raids got sent out, of which nearly half involved no deaths at all. How about that? And as I mentioned, it would be unfitting for any religious prophet to buy into a concept of necessary evil. Our prophet said what our book said. You return evil with something good. Nothing evil. For our prophet, peace be upon him, the matter is very clear. Allah commanded him to make the raids and battles in obedience. He did them. That makes them morally good because God is morally good. If God commands something, it's the ultimate good. That thing must be good. And whether you're a Jew, whether you're a Hindu, whether you're a Buddhist, whether you're something else, if God, your God tells you to do something, obviously it's good. And in Islam, the things that our beloved Prophet did, he believed that God had instructed him. They are therefore ipso facto good, morally good. That's not to say that the Prophet saw, peace be upon him, all war as good. And therefore, war was an ordinary activity, part of Islam, like prayer. Prayer is always good. Never not good to pray. It's always good to pray. It's always good to give charity. It's never bad to give charity. But wars can be good and wars can be bad. And our book highlights examples of bad wars and says, fight against the people who are oppressors. Stand against them because oppressive wars are wrong. And a war against oppressors, even an offensive war, is morally good. It is good to stand against evil. So our book is clear that we are to stand against evil. We are to take armed violence against people who would do it to us or to others. And again, it's unmistakable, it's clear. We can try and read a pacifistic spirit into it. Standing against evil requires us to be more than pacifists. We have to be active in the stance against evil. But the interesting thing is, excuse me, in this era, we have only one example where God explicitly tells the prophet to fight a particular battle. and that's the Banu Qurayza. The Archangel Jibril came to the Prophet and said, why are you taking off your armor? This is after the Battle of the Trench. You still have business to do. That's the only time in the story of our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, where God explicitly tells the Prophet, peace be upon him, now go and fight. So how did the rest of the occasions come about then? We as Muslims have a logic that isn't unreasonable if you believe the Prophet is a prophet. That is that the Prophet didn't do things unless Allah told him to. The Prophet did things, therefore, using deductive logic, the Prophet did them because God told him to. And if that's true, then they are inherently good because God commands good. So that's not too hard to refute if we are Muslims and believe our book. It says in the Quran, nor does he speak of his own inclinations, but only from a revelation sent down to him. This is talking about our beloved Prophet and his relationship with Allah's intentions for humanity. Now, I mentioned earlier that we shouldn't try and impose present-centeredness or anachronisms onto the past. So you'll see some people that, for example, Muslims during the period of the Cold War would say, oh, Muhammad was a Marxist. And he followed a Marxist ideology. Despite the fact that Marx was writing in the middle of the 1800s, and Prophet, peace be upon him, died an awful long time before that. Muslim scholars, believe it or not, even said things like that. The Prophet was a Marxist, or he was a capitalist. Well, no, he wasn't any of those things. He was a man of his time who understood the environment he was living in. And he understood that there were all of these tribes round about who posed an ever-present threat to what he was creating. The Prophet, therefore, sought opportunities to expand his power and his influence to the greatest degree possible by acquiring constantly additional increases of power at the expense of real or perceived rivals. Now, we think of power as being an ugly thing. Power isn't an ugly thing. If you don't have power, you're at the whims of people who have power. And some of the tribes were terribly powerful. And those little tribes that he created into a single ummah in Medina were at the powerless end of the scale. And there were some very big tribes, the Banu Bakr ibn Wa'il, the Ghatafan, there were others, the Quraysh, powerful tribes. And they were allying against him. So the only survivability strategy he could adopt, and this is the nature of the Prophet's strategy, was to continuously seek opportunities to expand his power and his influence at the expense of theirs. At the expense. He had to go up. They had to go down in terms of raw power. And it's according to this type of logic that the more military advantage that a tribe could have over others, the greater its security would become. And security is the fundamental responsibility of any leader, or even today, any government. The better its survival prospects would be if he were able militarily to gain advantage over others. Now, today we have a phrase, it's hegemony, which means the dominant power in a region that is beyond the easy threat posed by anyone else. And becoming a regional hegemon, it's a modern way of saying the concentration of power, was something that our Prophet, peace be upon him, wanted to become or wanted to achieve. Because if he didn't have that, his little ummah, this beautiful little flower called Islam that he planted, could not survive. The only way it could survive is create a type of hegemony in Arabia. to become the sole strength, the sole power amongst this conflictual, combative, warlike mess of different tribes out to destroy each other. That would involve him trying to make sure there were no serious threats to his security, even if the other tribes united against him. Today in modern theory, international relations theory, we call this balance of power. And people think balance of power means, oh, in the Cold War there was America and its allies on the one side, and on the other side of equal strength with the Soviet Union, because there was a balance, no one succeeded. It doesn't mean that at all. It's about the pursuit of this concept of hegemony, of being the sole power. And what happens is, when a small power makes an ambitious jump or striving towards greater growth, the others around it will feel threatened by that. They will try to create a balance of power by allying against you. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, saw this was happening. He lived in an environment where everybody was trying to create more power to become the hegemon. And he thought, I either play that game or I am defeated, and Islam is extinct. He saw what needed to be done. So he saw that becoming a regional hegemon was absolutely necessary to amass power and to have, ideally, sole power in Arabia. And it's only with that that he could guarantee the survival of this beautiful little flower. And at that point, he thought peace would come. Once I am the hegemon, or Islam is hegemonic, peace will come. And this peace is the ultimate good to be derived from the violence of war, with this in mind. But I repeat that in terms of what's called an animus dominandi in Latin, a personal lust for power that we attribute to a Stalin, or to a Hitler, or to a Julius Caesar, or an Alexander the Great. Our Prophet had none. There was nothing in his heart about himself and power. It was about the survivability of this ummah. Nothing within the heart took him on the desire for personal power over people or society. He merely anticipated that he would have to resort to the same type of self-help that he saw all the tribes using or operating. The tribes all understood that the safety, the security, and the stability, and the prosperity that they could accomplish could only be accomplished through commercial competition, arms, or alliances. And our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, did exactly that. He entered into commercial competition with the people of Mecca. He created an embargo upon them, denying them caravans of food and supplies getting into Mecca, which created a kind of an economic blockade. He fought battles, and he formed alliances, and did all three rather well. And I repeat, it isn't about the Prophet attaining power for himself, peace be upon him. It isn't even about the supremacy of Islam over other religions. The Prophet was remarkably tolerant, even in Arabia, with the other religions, and you can ask me about this. It's simply about survivability. In a conflictual environment where tribes are continuously fighting against each other, some tribes are being crushed and subsumed into other tribes through this type of violence, he wanted his community to survive. But continuously maximizing your power and influence comes at a risk. And I often think about, how come our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, took such a risk? Islam was powerless at its beginning. It was non-competitive by any measure after the Hijrah. Yet he took a kind of a strategic risk by saying, we need to be stronger. We're going to toughen up. We're going to become competitive. And in fact, we're going to become more than competitive. We are going to become the strength in the Hijaz. Now you imagine a little itty-bitty tribe or community pushing itself forward like that. Immediately the other tribes will see that and say, oh no, you don't. So why did the Prophet take that kind of risk? If I wasn't a Muslim, I'd say gamble. But we don't gamble, and neither did the Prophet. The answer is because he's a prophet. And if you believe that God is with you, or at least you're with God, you will take risks that ordinary people, ordinary strategists, ordinary commanders would not take. And our Prophet lacked, no, a better way of putting it, he had no doubt that Allah was with this ummah, that Allah was saying, create this thing that's of goodness to the world. Create it and take it to the world. And so he had this confidence to seek hegemony, to seek to become a power, knowing that in the very act of doing so, other tribes would ally against him. And we see exactly that happening. Aware that increases in his power would result in decreases in their power, the other tribes allied against Islam. And we know of all of these types of things. The Quraysh's attacks, for example, the Battle of Uhud and the Battle of the Trench. These weren't just by the Quraysh. The Quraysh went and got their allies and tried to amass a force greater than Islam could withstand. So they allied with the Jews of Hayward, or they allied with other mercenary groups, or with the Ghatafan, this big Bedouin confederation, to try to crush Islam. And that was an inevitable consequence of Islam's pursuit of power to maintain its survival, so that it could give peace and prosperity to its people. The Hawazin and the Thaqif tribes, after the opening of Mecca, terribly, terribly peaceful. We know that there was a bloodless opening of Mecca in the year 630. This created a big problem for the Hawazin tribes and the Thaqif tribes that were in and around Hunayn and Ta'if. And again, you see this kind of balance of power. Those tribes said, my God, Muhammad's getting too strong. We have to ally against him before it's all over for us. And those tribes began to march towards Mecca to crush Islam once and for all. And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, sent out a very strong army, 12,000 strong, and defeated the enemies in Battle of Hunayn. So just to wrap up now, it seems to me that this strategy that the Prophet had was deeply intelligent and very well considered. And it worked very well, alhamdulillah. He continuously sought to maximize power and influence at the relative expense of his rivals. His power had to go up, their power had to go down. So it was a relative experience. He worked hard to separate his rivals from the strength that they might get from being allied against him. And he was continuously trying to pry apart different tribal clusters that were trying to join against him. And by the end of his life, in the year 632, our beloved Prophet, through this strategy, had achieved a degree of hegemony in much of Arabia. And Islam, alhamdulillah, survived. This little thing that looked like it had no chance suddenly became the basis on which now a quarter of the world's population find comfort and solace and joy and pleasure and spiritual meaning, alhamdulillah. So that's all I have. Thank you terribly for your patience, and happy to take any questions.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know you put it up first, but we'll have to first.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm gonna ask a very, very quick question. I've got a couple of them, but I'll start with an easy and yes or no question. Thank you very much, Professor Joel. I think it was a very eye-opening seminar for me. I do believe that your faith is stronger than mine. So that's why I feel humble and lucky to listen your seminar. Are there any interfaith or dialogue activities that our prophet applied in his leadership?
In what way? Can you try and rephrase it for me so I get your exact meaning?
So I don't know, as a scholar with a deep understanding of his leadership, I don't know if you encounter any example of like dialogue or interfaith that he used with other Jewish or Christian.
Yeah, you know, when the Prophet, peace be upon him, first went to this oasis that we now call Medina, there were whole lots of tribes. It was more Jews lived there than non-Jews. The Jews were stronger than the non-Jews. All Arabs, by the way. The Kainukar and the Nadir and the Qurayza were Arabs. The religion was Judaism. When the Prophet arrives there, he enters into peace treaties with all of them. And we know of the Dustur al-Medina, the Constitution of Medina, the so-called document that he allegedly made at that point. We're not exactly sure if that's true, that originates from that point, or that it's even talking about those three Jewish tribes. None of them are named in it. But we do know from the Sirah that he made individual treaties with those Jewish tribes, which was what we today call non-belligerence. It's like, we don't want you to fight us, so we promise we won't fight you. We just live in a state of peace. You go about your Jewish stuff and do what you want, and we don't interfere. And we do our Islamic stuff, please don't interfere. Now, that lasted okay for a time. In Al-Medina, there was the Kainukar were enormously successful in commerce. They had a big souk, very famous souk, and the Prophet traded with them happily. They had a school called the Beit al-Midrash, in a place called Zuf, just near to the Prophet's mosque. He sent his young people to go and become literate in the school of the Jews. So the relations started out to be pretty damn good. It soured with those three tribal groupings in Medina, for reasons that most Muslims know. And two of the tribes were either partially or completely expelled, and the third was dealt with more zealously. Some of those went up to Hayward, and then the Prophet, because they posed a threat and they joined twice against him in war, had to do something about them. It wasn't because they were Jews, it was because they were armed enemies. But above Medina, from Medina all the way to where Aqaba is now, effectively was Jewish. Just like from Mecca downwards was mostly Christian in the 7th century.
Yeah.
So how did he get on with these people down here in the south and these people up here in the north? The answer is famously, he would go up and into the area of the Jews and say, who wants to make peace with me? They would say, we do. And he entered into easy agreements with them to pay almost no tax. One dinar per male head of population per year. That was the tribute they had to pay, almost nothing. And the Christians of Najran in the south, almost nothing. So relations between them was pretty good. And he left their religions alone. And in fact, there's a beautiful story. The Jews of Hayward, he fights against them and defeats them in their fortresses. And then he imposes upon them the tribute that they had agreed to pay to the Ghatfan, this big Bedouin tribe, in terms of the amount of dates they would now give him. Then what happened is the Jews of Hayward came to the Prophet and said, we're really upset about something. He said, what is it? He said, your people took our Torah scrolls, the books, the scrolls, the religious texts. And the Prophet was outraged that this would happen. And he said, who took the books of the Jews? Who took these books? That's their holy books. Give them back. How can a people be without their religious books? Give them back. And these guys who were taking this as their ghanima, their spoils of war, came forward like all sheepish. Oh, Prophet, we're awfully sorry. Here. and the Prophet gave the books back. So we often make this assumption that there was an antagonism on religious grounds that we just don't find. Again, in this struggle, competitive struggle for power, because power meant survivability, at some times there were conflicts with some Jews, not because of their religion, but because of their power. Other times, they just got on famously with them. And even the Chanukah, we always say, oh, expelled, and they went north, and we don't know what happened to them. Well, the same books of Sarah that say they were expelled say that some stayed in Al-Medina in partnership with them. They signed a treaty, were left alone as Jews. And in fact, when the Qurayza were besieged in their fortresses, who came marching along with the Prophet's army against the Qurayza? Chanukah. When he fights against the Jews of Khaybar, who goes fighting along with the Muslim army? The Chanukah. So you have even Jews fighting alongside our beloved Prophet with a close spirit of cooperation. So it's rather beautiful. And I'm all for interfaith dialogue because it breaks down barriers, breaks down misunderstandings. I don't believe, on the other hand, that you have to pretend that we have some homogeneous religion where we're all effectively the same. The religions are different. But the differences didn't bother the Prophet in that sense. You say, to you, your way, this is what we believe. And so differences, similarities were strengthened, commonalities were stressed, and the differences were respected. And that's a good model for today. We don't have to pretend we all believe the same thing. We can be happy saying, you are different to us, but we respect that difference. So does that answer your question?
Perfectly, yes. I have a couple of questions, but I will not ask. I will be reading for others. But I have a very cheeky request. If you are considering gifting a signed copy of your Leadership of Muhammad, I wouldn't say no.
As long as you take a selfie with them afterwards.
Oh, yeah, it would be a great pleasure. You know, I wrote that book very quickly. I've been studying the life of our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, for over 20 years. And I've been writing other things about relationship between Islam and Geneva Conventions and all these things that I do as my job. And I just put aside all these little bits that I found about leadership. And that book came together very, very easily. And the book I'm writing now on diplomacy, even more easily. Our Prophet, peace be upon him, was a master of diplomacy. And even though I've talked a lot about war and strategy today, his default setting was try diplomacy first. Diplomacy normally solves things. And this is what's missing in our world today. We get impatient, and diplomacy is a short-term process that ends too quickly. And we try it for a day or two or three, and say, okay, we try that, now war. And that's never helpful.
Thanks, Joel, for the presentation. So I teach military history, and there's obviously a fierce debate on television with what's happening in the Middle East. So I have three questions, which are very important, but which keep coming up. So, as part of the propaganda against the people of Gaza defending themselves, so the first question is, what is the number of personal kills associated with the Prophet? Because I haven't found one, so that's question one. Two is collateral damage ever justified in any of the texts that we have on the Prophet? And the third thing is something that came up quite recently, which is a really important question for me, which is, and I heard it from Hamza Yusuf, which is that there is a saying where the Prophet said, it was almost an instruction to break the bows and the arrows. What's the context for that? So I know there's three questions, but I'm sure that everyone in the room will really kind of like be inspired by just the conversations that are being had, and how can we defend the honour of the Prophet and being Muslim given the current debate that's being had online. Thanks.
Did the Prophet kill anyone? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. The Prophet killed people. He went to war, and we know that he cut someone's Achilles tendon in a battle, and he died. It's in the Sirah. We know that he shot an arrow, and someone probably died, and that's in the Sirah. He was a warrior. He wasn't a monster. It was war. It would be unusual if he didn't fight and fight zealously. In the Battle of Uhud, for example, he was almost killed because he was in the thick of it. What do you think he was doing? Just standing there chanting or praying? He was fighting. And his example as a warrior was greatly inspiring. And that's exactly what the Quran says. It says the rocks seemed to close in over the sky above. And the Hausen were waiting. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, leads his force down this valley. And these forces come streaming down on either side from the cliffs and attack him by surprise. And the Muslims all panic and run away. And the Prophet was then on a donkey. He was 60 years old. He had a bad back, so he rode a donkey, not a camel or a horse. Humble man. The Prophet's on his donkey, rousing his people back. He's got like half a dozen soldiers around him. That's it. And the enemy all around him. He doesn't flee. He stands there and calls his men back. And ashamed that this beloved man of God is there in the thick of it, they come back and they fight and win. And this is something we shouldn't be embarrassed about, that he was a warrior. Why would we be embarrassed about that? Again, he's fighting against what God tells him is evil. He's fighting for what God tells him is good. So I don't feel the slightest embarrassment about following a prophet who fought against evil on the side of good. Now, not all of the Sarah sources say that he killed, but some do. But that's the nature of the Sarah sources, is that they disagree with each other on lots of things. But I can't say that there's no books of Sarah that say he killed, because they do exist. So, what was the second question? I'm sorry, forgive me.
The second question was that in a case of war, is collateral damage ever justified, given the situation in the Middle East at the moment?
You know, that's quite hard. Geneva Conventions is a big part of what I teach historically in my career. We think of the Geneva Conventions as upholding the sanctity of civilian life, and it does. But in the Geneva Conventions, there's a phrase that's called foreseen but unintended. It is absolutely legally permissible to inflict foreseen but unintended harm on civilians. Fact. So if people die in war, but you see it's going to happen, but you don't intend it, you have not committed a crime. That's according to the Geneva Conventions, which are designed to protect civilians. And the other thing about it is the concept of military necessity, is another quote from the Geneva Conventions, is that you can cause harm that is foreseen but unintended, so long as military necessity is the reason why you do it. And you make every reasonable attempt to minimize the harm to the civilians. And so let's say that, for example, let's call it Israel is bombing Gaza, and it identifies that some Hamas fighters have run into a particular house, and next door is another house where there's a poor family sheltering and fearful of death. And you think, well, I can drop a missile on that house and kill those Hamas fighters. I know, I foresee it might cause the deaths of those people next door, but I don't intend it. I intend their death. And you do it. That will get reported on the news as a war crime. But it hasn't broken the Geneva Conventions. There's no violation of Geneva Conventions. On the other hand, if, for example, you know that the civilians are in that house and you target it anyway, and that is happening, then that's a violation of the Geneva Conventions. That's a war crime. The problem with it is combatants aren't supposed to fight where civilians are. So if for example, let's call it a city in Ukraine, so we'll take it away from Palestine for a minute, make it less emotional. Let's say that you're a Russian tank commander, T-72 tank going down the streets of city X. And there's an apartment building there, an apartment building there. You're in the city. And a Ukrainian soldier with a rocket-propelled grenade or an anti-tank weapon fires from an apartment window and destroys the tank in front of you, and the turret gets blown off and the crew are killed, and you're in your tank, what are you going to do? You swivel your gun, point it at the apartment building and fire. Now, you may kill that person with the anti-tank gun, or you may kill 5 people in the apartment next door. Your intention isn't to kill the civilians, but the risk is foreseen. It's foreseen but unintended. You have not committed a war crime. Even if you kill the civilians, it was foreseen but unintended. So it's really complex. But here's the thing. What we're told at the moment is, oh, there are Hamas people fighting from beneath the Shifa hospital. Therefore, the hospital is a legitimate target. The Geneva Convention doesn't say that. It's very, very explicit that even the presence of fighters in what's called a civilian object doesn't change the civilian nature of the object. So let's call it a hospital. Hospitals are always off limits as targets, 100% of the time. You cannot destroy a hospital even if it's full of fighters. A synagogue, a mosque, a temple, a church, an archaeological park, a kindergarten, a high school, a primary school. These are, by Geneva Conventions, off limits at all times, regardless of who's in it, good people, bad people. You can't destroy it. It is off limits. So Geneva Conventions is very clear that even the presence of fighters within a civilian building does not change the civilian character. And some things are considered objects of humanity. So a school, a religious building, a preschool, a hospital, an archaeological site, these things belong to humanity. And the Geneva Conventions is clear that they can't be targeted. Now that, you might think that sounds awfully noble, and it's never taken seriously. It is. During the Second World War, in Berlin, there was an Olympic stadium where Jesse Owens, this famous black athlete in 1936, had won 4 gold medals. Everyone knows the story of Jesse Owens and the snubbing of him by Hitler. The international community, the International Olympic Committee, owned that stadium. It's not a German target. So the British and the Americans bombing Berlin had to try ever so carefully to bomb around it without bombing that stadium, because it didn't belong to Germany. It belonged to humanity, the Olympic Stadium. And in fact, that stadium survived the war for that reason. That's how you have to treat hospitals and synagogues and mosques and churches and temples and primary schools and high schools and kindergartens. And that is not happening. And they are saying there are tunnels beneath it. There are fighters in it. The answer is, well, too bad. That's your bad luck. You can't hit it regardless. And that's a fact. So it's terribly, terribly distressing to see what's happening. My heart is broken for those people. And it's outrageous to destroy a hospital, regardless of who's in it. So to make you wait so long.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much for the very enlightening talk, and I really appreciate the honesty and straightforwardness with which you touched this rather controversy-ridden topic. I have 2 questions, and I promise I'll make it brief.
It's okay.
The first, you mentioned that the Prophet partook in offensive battles, but there was already a state of war in place. My question is, was there an incident whereby the Prophet began an offensive battle where there wasn't a state of war, where against a non-belligerent or a state that was not a belligerent? If yes, what was the explanation? If not, was it simply because it was impractical to open a new front, or was it inconsistent to the prophetic conduct of war? Second, you mentioned that it is part of the prophetic teaching that once the enemy has ceased hostilities, then we should stop fighting. My question is, how would you reconcile that with the current slogan that no justice, no peace? Meaning that even if the enemy has offered you peace, but when the Meccans, for example, are still occupying the houses of the Muslims and hasn't written it back, would you say that if that's the case, then Fatu Makkah wouldn't have happened? If at Hudaybiyah there was a permanent peace settlement as opposed to just a temporary ceasefire?
Well, do I know of any examples where the Prophet initiated war, offensive or defensive, against people that they were peace or neutrality with? I don't know of any examples. You know, truly the situation was entirely different to today's world. The tribes were just understood to be at war with each other. Sometimes they would make a temporary treaty. The Quraysh would join with the Hausen or somebody else to form an economic alliance for 5 years or 10 years or something. Those were abnormal. And the normal situation is that everybody was fighting everybody. All around were enemies. I was born in New Zealand. And coincidentally, New Zealand once had 60 Maori tribes. They didn't say, well, we are Maori. They said, we are Ngaitahu. This is the name of one tribe. They are different. They didn't say, well, we all look the same. We all put tattoos on our faces the same. We all wear the same skirts. And they didn't have any sense of commonality. In the time of the Prophet, they didn't say we're all Arabs. That's something that came later. And so they just said that we are Banu Bakr, and we are the Banu Qurayza, we are the Banu Quraysh, we are the Banu this. And all of them were distinct from those around them, because they were all based on genealogy, on who was related to who, and that bound them tightly. And those who weren't from that family were distinct. And this combative situation emerged because there weren't enough resources. And so everybody was trying to take, every season, control of the water holes that were needed for their herds of camels. The Prophet, peace be upon him, had camels. The Prophet knew that he had to protect his own camels, and that people were continuously trying to steal his camels and his grazing lands and his water holes. And so, just as the Muslims were doing it to others, it was being done to them. Everybody was in this situation. But you mustn't think because it's called a war or a campaign that it was a bloody affair. Most of them involved chasing away people. You mount up on your camels, ride toward where the enemies are trying to water their own camels, and they think, oh gosh, Muhammad and the army is here, and they flee. And no one is hurt. And so he created a network of spies, informers, whatever you want to call them, friendly allies, among the Bedouins and others, so that he knew where everybody was moving. And every time someone came with their camels to the watering holes that his allies or his own camels needed, he would send a force out and chase them away. Not such a terrible thing to do. It's because if you don't have water, your animals die. And if you don't get water running through your valley because someone's blocked it off, your trees die or your crops die. And so protection of resources and competition for resources is what lays at the heart of all of this conflict between all of these peoples. So did he ever aggressively go to war against anyone who didn't deserve it? Or wasn't at war with him? No. What was the other question? Forgive me.
The second question is on the notion of no justice, no peace. But you said that the prophetic teaching says that when the enemy has offered cessation of hostilities, even though they haven't necessarily offered a fair or just peace offer, you should still stop.
Not fighting was seen as an end in itself. So if a tribe is trying to fight you and you start to beat them or you frighten them and they say, okay, we don't want to fight you anymore, that was considered the end in itself. Then negotiations would take place to address whatever grievance lay behind the fighting. And so delegations would come to Al-Medina from all over Arabia, people that were coming to do their bay'ah to him and people that still had a grievance with him and they wanted to settle it. So they would come to him and say, look, what we did last year didn't work out so well between us, but here's an offer. What do you think? They'd negotiate terms, shake hands, deal is struck, and peace would, or non-aggression would exist again. And sometimes those things had to be renewed continuously. So during the battle against the Banu Nadir, for example, the second battle against the Jewish tribe, the Prophet was worried that the Qurayza would come and help the Nadir. So he goes against Nadir, puts the forces here to stop the Nadir coming out of their fortresses. Then he goes to the Qurayza and say, would you like to renew our peace terms? And the Qurayza say, we agree. So they sign a document agreeing that the renewed peace. The Prophet thinks, now we know that they're not going to attack us from the back. And he goes and finishes the job against the Banu Nadir. And by the way, the Nadir struck a very good deal. They said, can we simply leave with everything we own and everything we've got? And the Prophet said, okay. That was it. That was the deal. He just said, okay, we'll let you go. He didn't say, oh, we're going to enslave you, we're going to punish you, we're going to put tax on you. He said, okay. So that, to him at that stage, was the end of the matter. But the Nadir, as you know, went to Hayward, and it wasn't the end of the matter for them. They then conspired and sent forces against the Prophet 2 times, necessitating the Prophet finally to go and make battle against them after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So that's my best answer.
Siraj, oh, sorry. Colleen first.
Thank you very much for your enlightening talk. One student asked a question on a speech that Dr. Muhammad gave a couple of days back, where he talked about the conflict in Palestine and Israel from a land rights perspective, as in occupier and the occupied. And obviously, you look at it from the perspective of territorial integrity, where, especially for the Palestinians, their land obviously has been reduced considerably over the period in the last 5 years, etc. From the Seerah, are you able to shed some light into how would you look at that from a strategic perspective when the land that you own has constantly been taken away, and it's been taken away from a state perspective, from a self-determination perspective, and just navigating that terrain?
You know, this concept of a modern nation state that has borders only dates from Westphalia, 1648 forward. So we can't imagine that there was a concept of borders in the time of our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him. There was no sense that this is where our land stops and their land starts. No sense of that. They weren't even sure where Sham started and stopped. The whole thing that we call Sham, Syria, you know, was it sort of north of this village? Was it north of that town? It was sort of somewhere there. But there was no concept of this is where we stop and that's where they start. It was purely about what any particular piece of territory gave you in terms of resources. And so the Prophet would know, peace be upon him, that these watering holes belong to us and our allies. We don't know what exists beyond that, but those do. And those orchards belong to us and our allies. So if anyone comes into where those orchards are or puts their camels where our water is, that's a problem. But if they retreat even a mile or 2 miles or 10 miles from them, so be it. Our resources aren't threatened. They could be 100 meters from an orchard of dates. But if the enemy's not physically taking them, so be it. So that concept of resources is far more important than the concept of what's our land. Where does it start and stop? But if you apply that to today, you even see the Palestinians have no resources. They're left with nothing. So it's not viable anymore economically in terms of space with factories, for example, for modern production, of grazing land, of land for crops, of orchards. There's just nothing viable left of them in terms of resources even. So I used to think when I was a younger man that the 2-state solution was the right solution. That you have 2 states, one Israel, one Palestine, they live side by side, but we hope, God willing, there's peace between them. What's left for the Palestinians now? You know, because as you say, they've encroached. Now there's these tiny little pockets, at least in the West Bank. There's nothing viable for an economy. So I don't know what the answer is. It's terribly, terribly sad. But I was struck by that, you know, because we think of Sham as this mythical place that's north of Arabia. They didn't know where these places started and stopped. It was just this kind of amorphous, well, it's north of where we are, or it's south of where we are. And the other thing about this is we think of a map as heading north, and there's an arrow that always points north. The Arabs didn't think of a map in that sense. They faced west-east. In their mind, they thought that Africa is behind us, but it's part of us. Because the Red Sea is very narrow, and fishing boats went across every day, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. And the desert out there leads to Bahrain. And that's the main direction of our imagination. And so everything in the Arab mind was about what we now call the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, and Bahrain. And so even on a map, this thing called Sham didn't feature that heavily. There were Romans there, but there were enemies again all around. And so even the way we conceive of Arabia is problematic. That little strip called the Hijaz was the mind of the Prophet. It wasn't Arabia, this peninsula that looks like that. It was this piece here where he had to deal with tribes around him, make peace with them, had to defend against them, had to take war to them because of their evil or aggression or whatever. And lo and behold, we now live in a world where a quarter of the world is Islamic. Alhamdulillah. But it doesn't mean that that was, you know, in his imagination, the way it's created. He was a man who lived in a context of a piece of Arabia that was conflictual. And on an everyday basis, he was dealing with those issues. Behind that, he has this universal belief that this monotheism is good for all humans everywhere in the world. But on a day-to-day basis, his mind is just that tribe needs fixing. Because that tribe is arming against us, or that tribe is allied against our enemy. That's the nature of this period. And so it's very different to how we imagine it. And again, I don't know what will happen with Palestine, whether Palestine can ever be viable within those borders. It doesn't seem to be. There's nothing left, unfortunately.
Thank you. Joel, first of all, I just want to say, fantastic to listen to you in person.
Thank you.
Time. It's brilliant. Thank you. I'm mindful you've been stood there for some time as well. Two quick questions, very specific ones, hopefully. The first one, and I haven't read your book, so apologies. It may be in the book very clearly. So my understanding is that over the period of Quranic revelation, there were a number of practices and prohibitions that came over a temporal period. Are there any notable practices or prohibitions in the context of war that came about which were quite kind of dramatic or notable in the sense that they prohibited something given a local context? Was there any warfare tactic that changed for Muslims during that period?
Yes, I mean, one of the first things is to do with the treatment of prisoners. So when the second pledge of Aqaba was made, and the Prophet said that, you know, we will fight against your enemies. This is the first time we know the Prophet predicting that it's going to be warfare at some point. God reveals this revelation that it's permitted. They create this thing that's called, as I mentioned, the Constitution of Medina. And in that it talks about the relationship of the different tribes. But it also talks about the treatment of prisoners and how to ransom, this is interesting, how to ransom the prisoners. And so then we come to the Battle of Badr, and suddenly there's a dilemma where some of the Sahaba say, well, we don't think they should be ransomed. We think they should be killed. And Abu Bakr Siddiq, who says they should not be killed. We treat them humanely. And that's the view that won the day. But we're not therefore sure where that ayah comes from, when it came, which says it's unfitting for a prophet to have prisoners. And so placing that is quite difficult. Did it come in a campaign, one of the raids before the Battle of Badr? We do not know. And this is one of the tricky parts of trying to recreate history. We have what's called the Asbab an-Nuzul, and that means the circumstances of the revelations. There's 6,000, approximately 300 ayahs in Quran. And the Asbab an-Nuzul, as we understand it now, contains about 1,000 of those ayahs only. 2,000 of them we don't know when they came. We simply have a guesstimate. Say, oh, we think it happened in that battle. Oh, it happened in that battle. Or that event or whatever. Some of it we just don't know. So that's tricky. We do know exactly when the prohibition on killing women came. It came late. Now that doesn't mean women were killed. It doesn't mean that. We only know one woman killed in war, which was when, it says during the siege of the Qurayza, a woman threw a millstone down on a Muslim's head and crushed him to death. And the Prophet said she fought as a man, let her die as a man. And she died with the men. That's the only woman we know of who died deliberately during the wars of the Prophet. Up until the Battle of Hunain, the Prophet led his army, 12,000 strong, out towards Hunain. And they come to an intersection on the road and there's a dead woman. And the Prophet, this is in, peace be upon him, in many hadiths, all of the 6 Sunni hadith collections, this case is mentioned. The Prophet said, who killed her? They said, well, it was the battalion of Khalid ibn Walid. And the Prophet said, go ahead and tell Khalid, don't kill women. So we know exactly when that happened. But other things in terms of the principles of war, the laws of war, we're not exactly sure when they came. We think that some things came early, like protecting prisoners, which gives us a problem with that one ayah. We're not exactly sure when that came. But we do know that in this Constitution of Medina, if that's an early document from after the Hijrah, that would therefore apply to all prisoners thereafter. And indeed, that was the default setting of Islam. Is if you can let prisoners go or sell them off to their kinsfolk, do it. And that wasn't new in Arabia. In the so-called Jahiliyyah, that was always done. What are you going to do with them otherwise? You either kill them or give them back. And if you're going to give them back and you've got a chance of making some money for your community, you do that. Because they're going to do it to you as well. You know that if you get captured, one of your kinsfolk will go to your enemy and ransom them back. So it was just a common humane understanding. The interesting thing, of course, is that at Battle of Badr, the Prophet goes a bit further and says, who can read? You can read? You're free to go if you can teach these guys. So those are sort of interesting things that are quite unique to our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him. But whichever order they came, we don't find examples of inhumanity ever. So right from the first battles of Islam, we find this desire for humane treatment of people, even the minimization of harm to the enemy's forces. Like, don't kill them unless you have to. That type of thing. Right from the first to the last battle, that remains something that was constant with our beloved Prophet, peace be upon us. So I find, a few years ago, 5 years ago now, I took the Geneva Conventions, and I took all of the Prophet's battles, peace be upon him, and I mapped them over the Geneva Conventions to see if it's a good fit or a bad fit. What do you think my answer is? It's a good fit. The Geneva Conventions and the Islamic principles of war as found in the Prophet's battles, compatible. 1,400 years ago.
Just my second question is related to that, sorry. So, in terms of the conventions and treaties you mentioned for military warfare and so on, are there any notable examples where they cite Prophet's military strategy at the current times? Or are they taught in any notable way? Somewhere in the Western kind of European world?
Well, I've taught in staff colleges and military colleges where we teach the Peloponnesian Wars, where we teach the campaigns of Alexander the Great, we teach Napoleon and so on. we also, in those, some of those, teach the campaigns of early Islam, because there was an unprecedented expansion of empire.
Mm.
From the time of the Prophet's death in 632 to the time that Islam reached Spain in 711 is 80 years. And as well as spreading all that way, it spread all the way into what's now Pakistan and to the border of India and into Central Asia, this massive expansion. And so when scholars of war study success, they say, well, have a look at that then. And so Khalid ibn Walid is well known to scholars of war and terribly well regarded. He's seen as like a super general, a super commander. And so he's as studied as, not as much as Napoleon. Napoleon is still number one, but Khalid ibn Walid is right up there among the most studied practitioners of war. And in every military scholar's top 10 is Khalid ibn Walid. And somewhere close-ish is Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. In terms of what Muslim countries do, this will surprise you, they tend not to study it. And that really annoys me. I've taught in the Middle East for well over a decade, and before that I used to travel. I used to travel to Kuwait and different countries to teach military strategy, where, again, we would teach the Peloponnesian Wars, Athens versus Sparta. We'd teach the Battle of Gargamella with Alexander the Great. We would teach the Battle of Alesia with Julius Caesar. Nothing from Islamic history. And the Islamic principles of war, not taught. To be fair now, I lived recently in the UAE where we did teach it. And I was one of the people who, alhamdulillah, got to teach that, which is a great joy. And so at least there seems to be a sense among some of the more progressive countries that it's actually okay to study those things. And in the countries that don't, I'm not sure why they don't, whether it's a sense of embarrassment, that once we were great and now we're no longer great, or I don't know what it is. But there's wonderful principles to learn from the life and the leadership of our Prophet, peace be upon him. I think so.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay, should we wrap it up, Professor John?
Thank you.
And book signing and
Yeah, I'm glad. I've only bought a couple of copies, my own copies, if anyone wants to buy. I can sell the copies cheaply. And I'll be glad to sign them if that would help.
just to let you know, the next session will